Okay, well, I'm delighted to be rejoined by Connor Kianpour. This is part two of my interview with him, where in this part, we're going to be talking about duties or supposed duties. Connor denies that there are any such duties, or he's very skeptical of them, that members of marginalized groups have to their group, just in virtue of being group members. To toe the party line or like toe the ideological line of the group. So people often criticize women who are pro-life, especially because they're women, and people often criticize sexually conservative gay people, particularly because they're gay. And so there's an interesting debate about whether these kinds of duties to toe the party line of your group, simply in virtue of being a member of that group, exist at all. Connor, could you introduce the topic much better than I did?
Thanks again for having me. I think you did a really good job. So yeah, I'm just interested in whether members of what I call oppressed groups, the big three that I'm particularly concerned with are women, the Black community, and the LGBT community. So I'm interested in whether members of oppressed groups have special obligations to each other, meaning that they have duties to one another that they do not have to others and that others do not have to them. And over the course of my dissertation, I consider at least 3 different values to which somebody could appeal to try to explain why members of an oppressed group would have special obligations to each other. And I try to show how these values either don't generate obligations for members of oppressed groups, or if they do generate such obligations, the obligations are very modest. And the values that I address in the dissertation are the values of reciprocity, solidarity, and epistemic privilege.
Okay, so Connor, what the hell is reciprocity?
Reciprocity. Really easy concept, and it gets really complicated as philosophers like to complicate things. So the general idea behind reciprocity is that once somebody does good by you, you have some kind of obligation to do good by them. Discussions about reciprocal obligation are most often had in the context of political obligation, or the idea that you have an independent moral duty to obey the law that is independent of considerations of not wanting to go to prison or something like that. So there are some people that say that given that the people in your nation all take on burdens to your benefit, the burdens being complying with the laws of your nation. So your liberty is being restricted because you're complying with laws. And then you confer onto others in your nation the goods associated with living in a law-abiding society. And so given that this group of individuals has conferred a good onto you, you have some kind of obligation to do good by them as well. And somebody might say that the obligation that you have to do good by them is to obey the law. Since they have burdened themselves to your benefit by obeying the law and conferred on you benefits for doing so, you should likewise burden yourself to their benefit by obeying the law. And also reciprocity just comes up in different kinds of cases as well. So like tipping, for instance, in the United States, a lot of people think that you have an obligation to tip service workers because you benefit from other people tipping service workers, which incentivizes good service in the service industry. And it would be wrong of you to free ride off of other people's contributions to this system that you benefit from. So you as well have an obligation to tip.
I will link my interview with Stephen Kirshner on the ethics of tipping down below. We didn't discuss this argument at all. I think that's an interesting angle. Yeah. What's the connection between duties of reciprocity and then these kind of in-group duties not to be a Black conservative or a pro-life woman?
Yeah. So the thought, and so I want to make clear that in the literature relevant to the duties of the oppressed, there hasn't been anybody who has defended this sort of argument that I'm going to be running through, but there was somebody who defended something like the argument that I'm going to be running through. His name is Brando Simeo Starkey. He wrote this book called In Defense of Uncle Tom, Why Blacks Should Police Racial Loyalty. And the title might sound misleading. He's not trying to defend people who are called Uncle Toms. He's rather trying to defend the use of the phrase Uncle Tom to police Black people, essentially.
You should have put quotation marks in the title, but you didn't.
I think maybe he might have, or it was italicized or something.
I Googled it when I was. In fact, I have the tab open. We can check this right now. Brando Starkey, you've been caught slacking. It does not have quotation marks. I did a podcast with Alistair Norcross.
He's great.
Where we talked about the ethics of premarital sex, and we artfully omitted the quotation marks around premarital sex. So the episode title was just Premarital Sex with Alistair Norcross.
That's funny.
Sorry. Yeah. Anyway, big digression. Tell me about Starkey's argument.
So Starkey, he appeals to the value of reciprocity to try to defend this idea that members of the Black community should use terms like Uncle Tom to keep one another in line, so to speak. And the reason for this is in part because Black people today have benefited from Black people in the past taking on certain kinds of burdens associated with activism that has resulted in gains for the Black community. And so because Black people have been benefited in this way, they should likewise burden themselves in certain kinds of ways to confer benefits to other Black people. And so if there are people who don't take on those burdens, it's okay to call them an Uncle Tom because they're not paying the piper, so to speak. So, yeah, this idea, I think, of reciprocity might be really, really valuable in explaining why members of an oppressed group could be specially obligated to one another if, in fact, it's the case that members of oppressed groups confer benefits on their other group members that are significant enough to generate obligations of reciprocity to their other group members.
Yeah. So this is obviously pernicious and crazy, but your job is to tell us why. What's wrong with the reciprocity-based argument for in-group duties?
So the big problem with it that I think is underappreciated in the context of political obligation, and it would also make a problem for special obligations for members of an oppressed group, is that the value of reciprocity can only generate imperfect duties for people, meaning that people have a vast amount of discretion in deciding how they're going to benefit somebody who benefited them. So for instance, if somebody does something kind for you, like, I don't know, like my friend watches my cat for the weekend while I'm out of town, it seems like I don't have to watch my friend's cat as a way to repay her for doing something nice for me. I might instead take her out for dinner. I could give her money. I could say simply, thank you for doing that, right? So there are lots of different ways that somebody could discharge their reciprocal obligation to somebody who benefited them in an important way. And I think that when it comes to trying to make the claim that members of oppressed groups have obligations to engage in certain kinds of activism, so as to benefit their other group members because past group members have benefited them, I think it's mistaken to say that they have an obligation to engage in activism, because it seems like there are a lot of different things that they could do to try to pay it forward. So I give, for instance, the case of Clarence Thomas in my paper, Black conservative Supreme Court justice in the United States. He is often criticized for having benefited from race-based affirmative action policies. He wouldn't have gone to, I think it was Yale, if it weren't for the fact that there were race-based affirmative action policies in place. And so a lot of people say, well, Clarence Thomas can't possibly engage in activism against affirmative action because he benefited from it before. And if he starts now opposing it, he will have been guilty of free riding, essentially. But my suggestion is that Thomas could do other good things for the Black community that don't necessarily involve him having to reject or embrace race-based affirmative action policies. So he might, for example, donate money to a Black majority inner city school. He might sponsor scholarships for like exceptional Black students. He might, just by being a Black conservative Supreme Court justice, empower and encourage young Black people to strive for important social roles in society. So like there are lots of different ways that a member of an oppressed group can pay off whatever debts they have to their other group members without it having to be specifically in the form of engaging in a particular kind of activism.
Yeah. And this point is really important because even if somebody thinks that like Clarence Thomas in fact has done nothing to benefit the Black community, it could like there'd be nothing particular about his opposition to affirmative action that he'd be subject to criticism for. It would just be in general, Clarence Thomas is a bad team player. There's nothing particular about like any of his Supreme Court decisions that would make him liable to criticism, right?
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Right. So I mean, I take it that people who are criticizing Clarence Thomas, other than the very true sexual harassment allegations, like criticizing him for his affirmative action policies, are criticizing him like for those policies in particular, right? So like they're criticizing him in particular for doing a disservice to the community that benefited him when it comes to affirmative action. But like if your point holds, if it's true, then there'll be no criticism you can make that's kind of particular to affirmative action. The criticism you'd make rather is just that Clarence Thomas in general has been a bad team player. He hasn't donated to intercity schools, for example, or like he hasn't done anything. So, but like importantly, that's the criticism. But the criticism people want to make is that he violated in-group duties by opposing affirmative action.
Yeah, great. And I do also want to point out, though, that I think that in this, Clarence Thomas, to the extent that we are understanding him as a dissident member of an oppressed group, I want to point out that being a dissident member of an oppressed group is itself, I think, the kind of thing that somebody can do to pay off whatever debt they could be claimed to have to the rest of their community. And the reason for this is because having like plural perspectives about what is best for a particular oppressed group, duking it out in the court of public opinion, is valuable for helping members of that group try to figure out what is best for their group. And so by engaging in the kinds of activism and by holding the particular positions and views that he does, I think that Clarence Thomas does a really big intellectual service to other members of the Black community, because even if it turns out that we should embrace affirmative action policies, Thomas's arguments give us something to work with for trying to explain why that's the case. And also, it might turn out to be the case that we should have the attitude toward affirmative action policies that Clarence Thomas suggests that we should. And if that's the case, thank God he was there to be saying that, since other Black people seem to have been silent on that matter. So yeah, I think that you're right that the most robust kind of criticism that somebody could make of Clarence Thomas, if the point that I brought up earlier is true, is that Clarence Thomas just isn't a team player. But then I would respond to that sort of concern by saying that being a team player isn't the most important thing for bringing about good ends for an oppressed group. And we should be concerned with the good ends rather than with people being team players as such.
Yeah. So like this point about how being a dissident is in general good for oppressed groups, or just like having dissidents in your ranks is good for those groups, I think that's broadly true. But there are certain kind of craziness constraints on that. So like plausibly Kanye West's views are not like the kind of intellectual diversity that benefit the Black community a whole lot, because the views are too crazy. And like plausibly on the other end, people like Thomas Sowell and Clarence Thomas have like views about which people can reasonably disagree, and so like the point holds for them. And then there are going to be borderline cases like Candace Owens, and so like sometimes it's going to be kind of hard to figure out whether like the kind of craziness constraint has been violated.
Yeah, but I do want to point out that like the craziness constraint, I think, just points out cases in which if you have an intuition that something that somebody is saying is super crazy, you would think it's crazy regardless of whether or not it's a Black person saying it. Or so like social identity wouldn't matter once we pass a certain threshold of craziness in the views that are being espoused by a particular member of an oppressed group.
Oh, right. I mean, so I was thinking that like if we bought this thought that like members of the Black community have like a sort of imperfect duty of reciprocity, and that like they could fulfill that by holding dissident views. It's plausible that like you wouldn't fulfill that by having completely crazy views that like brings the whole community into disrepute, right? So like then identity would be relevant. If you bought reciprocity stuff. So like another way that people try to argue that there are these in-group duties is appealing to solidarity. So what is the value of solidarity?
So that's a great question, because after reading a whole bunch of literature on solidarity, I still don't think I'm sure I know what it is. The impression that I get is that solidarity is a value that involves members of a group being obligated to promote cohesion within their group. And part of the explanation for why members of a group should promote cohesion within their group is going to have something to do with the value of the group. So proponents of solidarity will in general not think that members of the group of all people who have brown eyes have solidarity obligations to each other. And they would say that that's because that group doesn't have a particularly important value that it promotes. And so we shouldn't think of that group as being the kind of group that generates obligations for its members. But then on the other hand, proponents of solidarity often appeal to the value of solidarity to explain why members of the same family and why members of the same nation or polity would have special obligations to one another. And so in my dissertation chapter on solidarity and the duties of the oppressed, I consider whether a successful analogy can be made between the family and oppressed groups and polities and oppressed groups. And I conclude that neither of these analogies succeed. Therefore, we're on strong grounds to conclude that considerations of solidarity can't explain why members of oppressed groups have special obligations to each other.
Yeah. So, like, would you elaborate on what you think the differences are between like these in-group duties and duties of solidarity that, say, siblings have towards one another? Because, like, you know, given like the language that both groups use, right? Like, language of brotherhood and sisterhood is like present in both siblings and in oppressed communities. So, like, what's the difference, if any?
Yeah. So I'll start with the family, but I want to also note that there's a lot of overlap between my arguments against the analogy to the family and the analogy to polities. So the first sort of thing that I would want to point out about the family is that I think part of what explains why members of the same family are specially obligated to each other has something to do with the opportunities for intimacy that exist within a family. And so intimacy, as I understand it, is an achievement involving developing dispositions of care. And it's often a long-term sort of achievement. And it's the kind of thing that can't be forced. So if you were to put like a gun to two people's heads and say, be intimate with each other, that wouldn't, the resultant interaction between the two would not count as genuine intimacy, on my view. It has to come from a volitional space of the agent. So it seems to me that part of why we take the family to be such an important institution is because the family is structured such that it's possible for every member of a family to have opportunities to be intimate with all of the other members. And it seems like that sort of characteristic is not present in the case of oppressed groups. And so I make this comparison where I say, to motivate this idea that intimacy matters for familial obligation, I consider the reader to evaluate the difference in judgment between their sense of the obligations that members of a quote unquote nuclear family would have to one another versus the obligations that all of Genghis Khan's children would have to one another. So for those who don't know, he had upwards of 16,000 kids. And it seems like the fact that those children are likely not in a position to develop intimacy with any of the others suggests that they really don't have special obligations to each other in the way that members of a family that have like 4 kids in it would have opportunities for intimacy. And so if you agree with me that that's enough to show how like Genghis Khan's children don't have obligations to each other that are special, that you should likewise think that members of oppressed groups don't have obligations to each other that are special, because An oppressed group is a lot closer to the group of all of Genghis Khan's kids than it is a tight-knit nuclear family. Okay, but then you might say, well, no, Connor, all you showed is that Genghis Khan's children have significantly weaker obligations to each other than the obligations that members of the four-child family would have to each other. And so my response at that point would be, we should interrogate what the value of the family is and what the value of oppressed groups are, and try to determine whether the value of oppressed groups is such that it can generate obligations for their group members. And my contention is that while the family has goals that reasonably lead us to conclude that members of the same family have special obligations to each other, the same is not true in the case of oppressed groups. So in the case of the family, we have goals of the family being the production of well-adjusted and productive members of society, and an institution that provides lifelong or as close to lifelong support to any individual, right? And so it seems like, given those two goals, it makes sense that members of the same family should look out for each other in certain kinds of ways, because it's by looking out for each other in those certain kinds of ways that you can achieve the goal that you want to achieve. But with oppressed groups, it's not clear what goal it is they have. Some people might be tempted to say that members of an oppressed group have the goal of resisting their own oppression. And I don't think that that's a goal of an oppressed group. I think that oppressed groups don't have goals, and that there are some groups that do have goals, and those are the groups that should be concerned with resisting oppression, not the oppressed group. So the two sorts of groups that I think might have goals involving resisting oppression involve polities. So states, they have a civil apparatus at their disposal that they can use to resolve coordination problems in the quest to bring about social justice. And also voluntary political advocacy coalitions. So there are groups of people that already exist who are all themselves voluntarily committed to causes of social justice. And in part because of this voluntary commitment, and in part because these groups tend to be heterogeneous, they include both members of oppressed groups and those outside of oppressed groups, that this kind of group is better suited to trying to bring about the eradication of the oppression to which an oppressed group is subject than the oppressed group itself as such. And so because oppressed groups as such can't be claimed to have some kind of goal that generates special obligations for all their members, we should think that the analogy between the family and oppressed groups fails.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's one more type of argument you consider for these kind of in-group duties. It has to do with the thought that dissenters from these groups really should know better. So what is this argument?
So I call this the epistemic privilege argument. So the first premise of the argument maintains that members of oppressed groups are uniquely epistemically privileged about their oppression and how to overcome it. There's a lot of support for this thesis in feminist standpoint epistemology, and in critical race studies. So there are people like Richard Delgado, who suggests that white people, they have these ineradicable biases for the unjust status quo. And even if they're not motivated maliciously to support certain kinds of unjust states of affairs, they're going to nevertheless be motivated to do so because it would be to their benefit as a white person in society. And so he thinks that the fact that white people suffer from this epistemic defect implies that people of color have an epistemic advantage over white people when it comes to reasoning about oppression, because they, unlike white people, are not motivated to privilege the status quo. Okay. And then there are also people like Mari Matsuda who talk about how those who speak in the voice of oppression are more likely to bring about a just world than those who do not. Yeah, so that would be the first premise of the epistemic privilege argument. The second premise of the epistemic privilege argument is that if it's the case that members of oppressed groups are uniquely epistemically privileged with respect to their oppression and how to overcome it, that this means that they will sometimes have special obligations to one another grounded in this unique epistemic privilege that they have. And so from premises 1 and 2, you get the conclusion that there are at least some cases in which it can be claimed that a member of an oppressed group should have known better than to act in a certain way, and that that claim would not apply equally to somebody who was not a member of the oppressed group acting in the same way as them.
My initial thought, and this is not a persuasive response to the argument, is just to think, okay, take any proponent of this argument and put them in a room with Clarence Thomas and have them debate affirmative action, and we'll see who should have known better. I mean, so like the person making this argument seems to be, you know, if they're using it to criticize Clarence Thomas in particular, they're imagining delusionally that they're an epistemic peer of Clarence Thomas or even a superior, and you know that's just a crazy thing to think. Any proponent of this argument would be completely wrecked in a debate on affirmative action with Clarence Thomas, or on like racial disparities with Thomas Sowell, and so like that's the reason I'm not inclined to take it seriously, but that's entirely ad hominem. So, well, what's an actually persuasive response to this argument?
Well, I guess maybe, so I did a little bit of work to motivate premise 1, and I realize now that I should have motivated premise 2 a little bit more. Okay, and I think maybe by motivating premise 2, the argument will become a little bit more plausible.
Say again what premise 2 is.
This idea that if members of oppressed groups have this epistemic privilege I'm talking about, that it would then generate obligations for them. So Ashwini Vasanthakumar, she has 2 papers that are excellent on the duties of victims in response to injustice. So she gives us 3 cases in her paper. So the first case, let's call it drowning victim. And drowning victim involves 4 people who are drowning in the ocean, and one of them is able to swim to shore and save themselves. Vasanthakumar's claim is that that person who saved themselves is in the best position, given what they know, to be the ones to go and provide assistance to the other people who are drowning. Like, they obviously don't have to jump back in the water, but they could find somebody who could help these other drowning victims, right? And so she says it's because this person has knowledge of a certain kind in virtue of the fact that they went through the same thing as these other drowning victims that generates for them an obligation to go get help for them. Second case, let's call it torture victims. So suppose that there are 4 people who are being held hostage in some terrible foreign land, and one of them is able to free themselves at some point and is able to seek asylum in a country somewhere else. So Vasantha Kumar wants to say that if you think that the drowning victim should have gotten help for the other drowning victims, given their epistemic position, you should also think that the torture victim who sought asylum should use their epistemic privilege to get the other torture victim some kind of help. Obviously, she acknowledges that there might be certain kinds of personal costs that would be too high to expect anybody to take on to assist these other torture victims. But her point is that there's a presumptive obligation to use your epistemic privilege to help out those torture victims. And it becomes less morally determinate what specifically you're supposed to do to help the torture victims, as compared to the case with the drowning victims. But nevertheless, you have some kind of obligation. Now, case 3, structural injustice. So imagine that there is an individual who is routinely treated poorly. It's a woman in a workplace who is routinely spoken over and kind of belittled by her male colleagues. And her male colleagues do the same sort of thing to other women. It seems like your epistemic privilege in that case would give you the same reasons to perform some kind of action to the benefit of other women in your workplace as in the case of the torture victims and in the case of the drowning victims. So you might, for instance, think that you have some sort of presumptive obligation to file a complaint with human resources. Or you might think that you have some kind of presumptive obligation to console your female coworkers when they experience sexism in the workplace or something like that. And again, your obligation that you have to your female coworkers in this last case, it's less morally determinate than either the obligations that somebody has in the drowning victim case or in the torture victim case. But nevertheless, you could say some kind of obligation exists. And so if it's the case that members of oppressed groups have some kind of epistemic privilege that puts them in a position to actually help their other group members in a way that no other person could, then it seems like they do have duties grounded in epistemic privilege to help their other group members.
Okay, great. So that's the argument. If you would just set it up one more time in premise conclusion form so the audience has the big picture in mind, and then tell us why you think this argument fails.
Premise 1, members of oppressed groups uniquely have epistemic privilege about their oppression and how to overcome it. Premise 2, if premise 1 is true, then members of oppressed groups have special obligations to one another grounded in their epistemic privilege. Conclusion, members of oppressed groups have special obligations to one another grounded in their epistemic privilege. Now, this argument, I don't necessarily think fails. I do think that there are some ways in which it has to be moderated. And I also think that there's a sense in which one of the implications of the argument should be made explicit. So the sense in which I think the argument should be moderated. So in premise 1, I think that it's inappropriate to say that members of oppressed groups uniquely have epistemic privilege regarding their oppression and how to overcome it, for 2 reasons. First, I don't think that the epistemic privilege is unique. I think that it's possible for there to be a group outsider who might be intimate with members of the group to such an extent that they might have access to that very same epistemic privilege. And moreover, I think it's also important to point out that I understand there to be a difference between epistemic privilege and an epistemic advantage. So an epistemic advantage is the kind of thing that gives you some reason to think that you're going to think better about an issue. But if you have a particular epistemic advantage, you could also have a whole host of epistemic disadvantages that go along with that. And you might, all things considered, not be in the best position to think about a particular issue. Epistemic privilege, on my understanding, is when you have an all things considered epistemic advantage when reasoning and thinking about an issue. And so my claim is that members of oppressed groups, we actually don't have that much reason to think that they are epistemically advantaged, all things considered, especially when we take into account that, especially with racial minorities, that on average, these groups of individuals have less access to educational capital, right? Additionally, members of oppressed groups, in virtue of being oppressed, might develop ill-formed adaptive preferences for the status quo, so as not to think that their circumstances are as bad as they really are. So there are lots of impediments that might stand in the way of members of oppressed groups thinking clearly about their oppression and how to overcome it. But beyond that, I think that if we were to claim that members of oppressed groups have this unique epistemic privilege that nobody else in the groups have access to, that we would be saddled with a troublesome implication, namely that we would be letting members of the dominant culture off the hook, so to speak, for their ignorance about issues that befall members of oppressed groups. Because they could just say, well, I couldn't possibly educate myself to the extent that you, as a member of an oppressed group, can. So I'm not going to concern myself with doing so because you're telling me that it's impossible for me to educate myself to the appropriate extent.
I mean, a proponent of this argument might say, well, all you have to do is just listen to a member of the oppressed group for 5 minutes, and then like the knowledge would be transferred to you.
Yeah, but then that move doesn't account for the existence of disagreement within an oppressed group. So yeah, you could come up with this deference rule of defer to a member of an oppressed group if you're not oppressed. But then there's this question of, okay, I'm listening to two people who are saying completely opposite things, who are both members of the same oppressed group. To which one of these do I defer? And there's no answer that the proponent of the argument can give.
Well, I mean, like an argument that they could give would be like the standard answer that you give to like a normal case where two experts disagree. If the topic that they're disagreeing about is completely beyond your ken, you should just like do a poll of the community of experts and then find out what the majority thinks and then defer to that. And so if like one perspective is dominant within the oppressed group, you should just defer to that perspective. A proponent of the argument might say.
Yeah, but then there's this question of expertise about oppression and how to overcome it is not it's not an institutionally defined expertise, right? So like, whereas in other cases, we can like point to a group of people and be like, let's pull them because those are the experts. We run into this additional problem in the sort of case that you're talking about of trying to figure out who the experts are, which obviously I think that's a problem for a lot of philosophical positions, but I think it's especially a problem in this kind of case because at least when it comes to say, I'm trying to figure out what I think about climate change. So let me consult these climate scientists. There's no like institutional setup for members of oppressed groups and people who think about oppression and how to overcome it that's comparable to the kind of institutional setup that exists for climate scientists that people could reliably go to and be like, this is the group of people I'm going to listen to and defer to. That doesn't exist with oppressed groups, at least not yet. And I hope that it doesn't exist, but yeah.
Yeah. So like this was you disputing premise one.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So then premise two, I just mostly want to make a clarification about premise two. So I would be okay if it turned out to be the case that many members of oppressed groups have obligations to other group members grounded in considerations of epistemic privilege, while also acknowledging that people outside of the group could have some such obligations as well. But I want to resist the conclusion that if that's the case, that means that we should think that engaging in one form of activism rather than another is the kind of thing that one's epistemic privilege should lead one to doing. So I think actually, if we take this epistemic privilege stuff seriously, what we will end up with is an obligation for members of oppressed groups to not be extremely punishing toward dissident group members, because presumably members of oppressed groups have intimate knowledge about the kinds of harms that befall people when they're ostracized from their communities. And if they have such epistemic privilege, they should use that privilege to inform their acceptance of dissident members of oppressed groups, rather than using the epistemic privilege argument to try to show that members of oppressed groups should engage in some forms of activism rather than others.
Yeah. So like, is the thought you kind of accept the general theoretical setup with one or two caveats, but like you don't think it helps one to really like validate particular criticisms of dissidents like Lila Rose or Coleman Hughes or Andrew Sullivan? Like you need more information to make those criticisms stick.
Yeah, and most importantly, I think for my purposes, I want to make sure that people know these are not special obligations for members of oppressed groups. It's just that as a socially contingent matter of fact, these obligations are going to be generated for a lot of members of oppressed groups, but the principle that's being appealed to is a general principle that has nothing to do with one's group membership as such.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems right to me. I mean, so, okay, you've been thinking about this topic for a very long time. You care about it a lot. Do you have kind of a big picture rant about the topic that you could give in closing, or any kind of general thoughts about these kinds of expectations that groups put on defectors?
Yeah. So I guess the most important thing that I want to say is that it's really easy to brand people that you do not know as idiotic or pernicious or self-hating or worse. And I notice that people are very, very quick to brand dissident members of oppressed groups with labels such as that. And I think it's really important for us as members of a cooperative society to try to actually understand what people are saying, even if it's tempting for you to use put downs to try to get somebody to stop speaking just because they're treading waters that most people are not treading. I think that if you're committed to liberty, you should think that dissident members of oppressed groups should be allowed to do their own thing. particularly if it's cases where they're just engaged in dissident activism about which there's reasonable disagreement in society. So I'm not saying show sympathy to the gay person who says that all gay people should be exterminated, right? Like, we're allowed to have criticisms of people like that. And I also think that we're allowed to make criticisms of the positions that people hold. But I think that the mistake that we make is when we start criticizing people for the positions that they hold in virtue of their social identity. Like, maybe I'm just like a romantic or something, but I would like to think that our world would be better if everybody stopped caring about placing expectations on others based on what their social identity is. And that moves me now to talk about, if you care about equality, you should certainly care about members of dissident members of oppressed groups being allowed to do their thing. Because if every other person in every other group could say the same thing as you and get away with it, but because you're Black or because you're a woman or because you're gay, you say the same thing that everyone else is saying, but you have to shoulder burdens that nobody else does, that's paradigmatically unfair. And I think that we should aspire for a society, if we care about equality in some substantive sense, in which we allot the burdens and benefits associated with social practices in a way such that members of society who are oppressed are not burdened even more than they already are in virtue of being oppressed. And then lastly, I just think if you care about knowledge, you should care about dissident members of oppressed groups, because
on this channel we don't care about knowledge.
Because they provide epistemic resources that nobody else provides for thinking about issues that are highly specialized and mostly of concern to members of oppressed groups. And because dissident members of oppressed groups are iconoclastic in virtue of the fact that they have the opinions that they do, they can often get members of the dominant culture to start caring about members of oppressed groups when before members of the dominant culture wouldn't have. And I think all of those considerations should lead us to thinking that dissident members of oppressed groups are a good thing. And if we're going to criticize them, we should only criticize them because they're wrong, and never because they are gay, because they're women, because they're Black, because they're Jews. Take your pick. I guess that's my rant.
Well, that was a wonderful rant. I really enjoyed this conversation. Connor, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.